I started coming back to Hinsdale, I think at the age of 5. My parents came back, we all came back for a couple of weeks. And that happened, I think, 2 or 3 summers in a row. And at some point, I don't remember doing this, but my mother tells me I started asking to come back every summer. And essentially, I was trading away time with my friends in California with time with my grandparents and the greater family in the town. And that lasted all the way from the age of 5 to 16. And at some point, it became more than a week or two, it became a month or two. And for me, it was a very rich experience, being able to be around your family, your greater family, your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, your second cousins, became very rich. As a comparison to metropolitan areas, I don't think you're as connected to your family. And I think that's one of the special things about being in a small farming town like this is you are very connected to your family. And there's a lot of values, I think, in a cold weather farming town from being around your grandparents, that you learn stuff about who you are, who they are, and there's values in working and playing on a farm with your grandparents and your parents that you couldn't get in a more metropolitan area where your parents work for corporate America, right? It's a very different world, and I think it's a disadvantage for a lot of people who don't get to spend time with their family tree as intently as you get to do in a small farming town. So for me, it was always a joy to come back. As a kid, I looked up to both my grandfathers, and I got to work, play, and live in their back pocket. Ironically, that produced a lot of value for me later in life, in my professional life. But I always enjoyed that, and two of my favorite experiences are hanging out with both my grandfathers. One was moving cattle with Johnny Porteen, and the other one was working on the hog farm with my grandfather Rosendahl. I never saw it as work as a kid. I always just thought it was as fun as all get up. But it also produced lifelong value lessons that produced value for me throughout my entire life. That to this day I still look back and it's amazing and blessing to have that, because I don't think a lot of people in metropolitan areas can have that experience where they get to go hang out with their father or their grandfather in a work setting, right? And there's a certain amount of value-driven richness that comes back to you as the individual, because generally in metropolitan America, the kids go off to school or daycare or hang out with their friends, and they're disconnected from the people who work and how they work and what they do. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect in that environment versus living, or like I was, coming back here for the summers and be able to spend time with loved ones in what they do for a living. So that was always a lot of fun to be around. And I always saw two grandfathers who worked hard, worked smart, worked long, and at the same time I never saw them complain about working hard. When you go back to a metropolitan area, you don't see that. So I always truly enjoyed coming back here as a kid. And it didn't dawn on me until much later in life how that helped me as an adult professionally. And then as a commercial banker, I do business loans for people who run their own business. And I noticed a habit of mine, and I couldn't figure out why. I was looking for people as clients that walked and talked like my grandfathers. And I couldn't put it into specifics, but every time I talked to a business owner that started acting like my grandfathers, I get this little tingle in the back of my head. I'm like, wow, this guy's really like Johnny Porteen, or really like John Rosendahl. And I always found that they ran their business better and they had good numbers. And I rarely had any credit issues with people who walked and talked like my grandfathers. And it wasn't until I was in my 40s where I was watching a philosopher, talk about IQs. And he talked about high IQs, or IQs in general, by groups of people. And it was kind of fascinating to learn. And he said it's not an identified group, but the highest IQs often are cold weather forming Scandinavians. And I said, those are my grandfathers. My grandfather, Porteen, was 100% Finnish, firstborn, and my grandfather, Rosendahl, was 100% Danish, firstborn. And I could trace, the lineage back to the home countries as cold weather farmers. And so it was the family DNA. It is the family DNA of just about everybody on the High Line, right?
Yeah, a large portion of it.
A large portion of it is. And so that when I talk about my grandfathers, I'm really talking about cold weather farming individuals. And this philosopher talked about how cold weather farmers, cold weather ranchers have to have an IQ to make it work. And he talked about specifically why. He said it takes a high IQ to not eat your seed crop when you're starving, because you got to plant it in the fall and harvest it, several months around to create more benefit out of what you're growing for your operation. And I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. Then there was another point he made I thought was more integral from the wisdom side of life, is that as a cold weather farmer, you have to know how to solve complex problems with a world of limited resources. You're like, wow, that's definitely my grandfathers, but that's really every cold weather farmer. So when I talk about my grandfathers, I'm really talking about cold weather farmers and ranchers. So once he talked about that, I understood why I did what I did professionally and how that came from my grandfathers. And then he went into it more granularly. In his philosophy, he thought that 75% of your IQ came in your DNA and 25% came in your upbringing. And there's where my, spending time with my grandfathers really came back out to me later in life. It was fascinating to learn that much later after I was doing it or learning it. But I think there's a certain amount of value, and I think it's more so for people who grow up here, to be around your cold weather farming father and grandfather as who you become later as an adult, both in your value system and your work ethic and the type of human being that you are. So for me, I have, it's always been a positive, an immense positive experience. And the more I think about how that time with my grandparents, when I came to visit, really shaped a lot of who I became as an adult. And that really stems from being in a small farming town with cold weather farmers. And I recently just saw a headline that stated the happiest people are farmers. And I've always told my friends this in California, the happiest, when you think about cold weather farming people, you mostly think about men. But I've always told people in California the happiest women I've ever seen are all farmer wives. Hands down. When I compare coming back here and being around my aunts and my grandmothers and my cousins, and going back to metropolitan California, it's a noticeable, significant difference between the happiness level here and the happiness level there in women. I've always thought it was, when I was young, I couldn't put my finger on it. As I got older, I just found it fascinating. And so I've always felt like the small farming town is kind of an oasis to reset. Probably because I had that experience as a kid. It's always been able to benefit me to spend time here. And I've been living in a small farming town now for 4 years. Probably never going back to a metropolitan area. But that all stems from my time here as a kid and my time around my giant family. And we all have giant families in a small farming town.
You need the extra hands.
You need the extra hands, and because there's no turnover here, marriage tends to make the families bigger,
yeah,
and more connected. So, but there's a certain amount of, I just think, richness that comes from that you can't get in metropolitan America. Yeah.
So obviously your grandfathers had a very large impact on you. What were they like personally? How were they similar? How were they different?
You know, it's funny because I have a pattern recognition brain, and I always thought my grandfathers were different. You know, John Rosendahl had an irrigated farm, small, next to town, and had a business, college degree, worked in the military, Republican, conservative. Johnny Porteen gave up going to school in the third grade, a farming or ranching Democrat, had a dry land cattle ranch, uh, two of the most opposite human beings I've ever seen in the space of cold weather farming and ranching. And it wasn't until I became a banker and I looked for people who walked and talked like them that I realized they had the same core values when it came to running their operation. They were high IQ, they could solve complex problems in a world of limited resources. They had the same, I would call, frugality that came with being successful in their era. So they had similarities, but they were wildly different as human beings. John Rosendahl grew up in the Twin Cities as a city boy, and Johnny Porteen, small town America, and the quintessential cowboy. So from that perspective, from many perspectives, they were polar opposites, but when it came down to the core of running their business, they were very similar. It took me a while to see the similarities. Both were passionate cold weather farmers. To this day, I've never come across two people who worked that hard and were happier than anybody I've ever seen. Both like to have fun in their free time, which I think for both of them involved a little bit of drinking. Both kind of didn't mind gambling a little bit. I think the Porteen side probably liked to gamble a little bit more when they were younger. But I truly think they loved being on their property, running their business, because they would come out to California for a week to see us when I was young. And by day 2, they were on the phone. Did we get any rain? How are my animals? And it was like, by day 3, you were thinking, why don't you just go home? You know, that's where you want to be. And I thought both guys just never really wanted to leave.
And this was at a time that phone calls cost money, and as dirt farmers in Montana, that was an investment they were making to make that call.
Yeah, but it was more, you could tell where the passion lied,
Yeah.
right? You know, here they are hanging out with their family, and you know, after a couple of days, they're like, I really want to see what's going on my property. So, and you didn't, you know, I never took it personally, but you could just see where the passion lied. And I've always felt both guys, you know, hardly ever left the state, you know, outside of going to maybe Billings or Great Falls for some reason. They hardly ever left the High Line, and they both just wanted to be here, you know, running their cold weather operation and being around the community. That's all they really wanted to do, and that was where maximum peace and joy was. And so it was obvious from an early age. You could tell that they were happy doing what they were doing here, and that was always a great life lesson for a young person to see.
Yeah.
Right?
So which one of them had the better sense of humor?
You know, they both had a good sense of humor. If there's one thing I could go back and do more, it's probably spend more time with Johnny Porteen on the ranch. I probably spent even time between, or even more so, with my grandmother Porteen. I think Johnny wanted me to speak up and ask to go work out on the ranch, where John Rosendahl just said, get in the truck, we're going out to the farm. And so I was like, all right. So I don't know if I got to see that part of Johnny Porteen as much as I did John Rosendahl. So they both had a good sense of humor. But it was probably slightly in a different way. You know, Johnny's was probably more dry, because he probably wanted to be more soft and subtle about it, because I don't think he ever really wanted to offend anybody. Where John Rosendahl was probably a little more straightforward and direct in his humor. But they were both funny guys.
Yeah. So you mentioned your grandmother. You're obviously think very highly of your grandfathers and they're amazing men.
Yep.
I'm assuming that they attracted amazing women to their sides.
Absolutely. Both women. And this is partly kind of biblical because I think the Bible calls for men and women to be partners. And I think the ranching or farming man and his wife are as close to the perfect biblical aspect of partners that you'll find anywhere consistently. And both my grandmothers were true partners to their husband, and it was I think it translated into greater peace and joy for the house, for each of the individuals as husband and wife. I saw both my grandmothers in ways that is rich. That in today's culture, in metropolitan America, I'm not sure you see it as richly as I got to see it as a kid. And I did spend a lot of time around Mary and Porteen, cooking in the kitchen and being around my cousins at her house. And Eleanor, helping her at the hardware store when she was running it at times, and here in the house. But no, both my grandmothers were great women, great human beings.
Yeah. How was it having, the one grandmother was out on the ranch and the other one was a businesswoman inside? Did that seem like it was a difference or it was just a different type of business?
I don't think I focused on that too much. It's wildly different. Somebody who just takes care of a house and the kids or the grandkids at that particular time, and cooking for the ranch hands or the rancher, versus somebody who spends half a day running a hardware store, and a lot of time at the local Lutheran church. I don't think I really focused on that as much, as it was just great time with my grandmothers. I didn't really, the differences were there, but didn't really stand out as much as, I just enjoyed being around my grandmothers as much as I did my grandfathers. And the greater connection to family came through the grandmothers, right? Because they were always hauling around the grandkids and going over to aunts and uncles. So the familiar or the family part of it really came from the grandmothers. Where the grandfathers were working and you were out working with them, the connection to, aunts and uncles and cousins, and some of my cousins were the quasi brothers and sisters I never had as an only child. So that family connection really came from the grandmother side. And that was rich on both sides. Especially in the Porteen side, because all those connections are here. On the Rosendahl side, they came back just like I came back, but that was a bigger connection on the Porteen side because all the relatives are still in town.
Yeah, you didn't have to line up being back at the same time as
Yeah.
them. They were here when you came.
So on the Rosendahl side, it would be my dad's sister. Her kids would come back, and usually everybody came back for the 4th, so we were here at the same time. But that was, for a week. It wasn't for a month or two where I could run around with my cousins, a little bit more than the Rosendahl side. But yeah.
Yeah. So tell me more about your aunts and cousins. I know you have a large family in that way.
Yeah. I joke with my friends in California that this town's probably 400 or 500 people, and in town there might be 80 homes or something like that, and I could probably put a relative in every other house, through marriage or through blood. Directly across the street there are 2 houses with 2 second cousins. 2 houses up is my cousin, and across the street is another second cousin, and intermixed in between are relatives through marriage a couple generations ago, and you can do that all the way across this town. And but for me, some of my aunts were like sisters, and some of the older aunts acted like surrogate mothers. Some of my female cousins specifically are like sisters. and some of my male cousins were like brothers, and it really depends. I've got a lot of cousins and aunts I hardly know, and I've got some that I spend a lot of time with, and the ones I spend a lot of time with are the ones that felt like brothers or sisters or surrogate parents. And most of them still live in this area.
Yeah, so it sounds like probably the number one time to see everyone was the 4th of July. We just finished up our celebration here a few days ago. How has that changed over years? What was the typical 4th of July of your childhood?
So I personally think it's fairly similar to when I was a kid, because you have the parade, the ping pong drop, the barbecue, and the fireworks on the 4th. So that's relatively the same. And the day before was, back then, still now, is the rodeo and the street dance. I think what's kind of changed is when I was young, there were a few more events that made it more than a day and a half, made it more like 3 days, and there was a greater involvement of the park, which I think the town kind of got away from. And I don't know why per se, because it used to be very park centric, and that might have been because we, up until recently, we didn't have any events on the river in the park until we added the kayak event here a couple years ago. So I would say the changes would be, it kind of got compressed down to a day and a half versus maybe 2 or 3 days, and it doesn't involve the river, or didn't for many years recently, as it did as a kid, because they used to have like a barbecue in the park, and there was a couple of years where we had kayak races on the river, or they had games down in the park. So I would say the general concept is the same. I think that the amount of time and events has shrunk, and then the park and the river seem to kind of get taken out of it.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So what were some of your favorite memories with your cousins? That you can say on camera.
I used to torment 2 of my female cousins on a regular basis. It still makes me laugh, but I used to give, when I was at Marion's, 3 of my female cousins would go downstairs with me, and I would run upstairs and shut the door and turn the lights off because the switch was on that side of the door, and they would just scream bloody murder, and it would just make me laugh until Marion would shoot me a new one to let him out. And then one of those cousins I used to sit on and give the typewriter test to. That was something that always makes me laugh. Also embarrassing as an adult. They're still 2 of my favorite cousins of all time, and I cherish both of them immensely. And as an adult, I'm kind of sad that I did that, but it still makes me laugh. And then I would say on the male side, I always liked hanging out with the Jones boys and the Mogans boys. They were always fun people to hang around. Always good times. Those are probably the male cousins that are quasi brothers for me. A couple of the Mogan boys have some of the best comedic ability I know in the High Line, and the Jones boys were just always up for fun.
So what were probably the biggest bonding moments with those cousins?
I just, it very basic, just, they were like the brothers I never had. So there wasn't any one specific moment. It was just the family connection. Because as a only child living in California, you didn't have family like you do here in town. You got tons of family. You're constantly around them. So you might take that for granted when they're always here. When you come back for a few weeks or a month, you cherish that time because you only get to do it once a year for a limited amount of time. So I think just being around them was the part that was, and that goes for both the female and the male cousins, and aunts and uncles. I just didn't have that, and so it was, always always a cherishable moment because I wasn't here all the time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you spoke very highly of the lifestyle and the personality and the morals of your grandparents.
Yeah.
Were you able to see that filter all the way down through the generations of the different families?
Yeah, yes, because I think it's innately, I think one of the advantages I have is having spent so much time in metropolitan America and having spent significant time here, is you can see the differences. And so when you spend time in a small town, you automatically fly straighter. You walk with a little more vertical in your back because
It's a little different when you're related to everyone. They all know who you are. You can't get away with it.
well,
like in your
and they know your
city.
business in 3 seconds.
Yep.
When you run around in a metropolitan area, nobody knows you. You can do whatever you want. You can be as crazy as you want, and people are. And so I always joke with people that in California, like if I even think about going back to Montana, I get a phone call. You're gonna come see me, right? And that's the joke on how much they know your world, right? They know everything about you in 2 seconds. They even know it before it's gonna happen. Is the joke. So yeah, I think growing up and living in a small town promotes concepts in a rich way of kids, spouse, family, and community. And if you're going to do that successfully, you fly straighter, right? Your actions have to follow your words. And I have this funny story that kind of highlights this. When I was, I think, 12, I brought a friend of mine back here for a week. And he had a great time. And about 10 or 12 years ago, he called me out of the blue. I hadn't talked to him in probably 2 decades. He said, I just quit my job and I'm going back to Montana. I'm like, that's great. Glad to hear it, because I'm thinking about leaving the state too someday. I'm like, where are you going? He's like, back where you took me. And I just started laughing. And he's like, what's so funny? Like, you and I need to talk, because you can't roll back to small town America and act like you do from California. You'll get ostracized like this. So we went through this long conversation about how you conduct your business. Your actions need to follow your words. If somebody needs help, you help. And you need to dial back some of your habits and dial up some other habits. And a friend in town, a friend of my dad's, helped him get a really good business opportunity going where he was going to take over somebody else's business by working for him. And I thought, wow, that's really lucky, because the business is a really good business financially up here. And somebody helped his wife get a really good job in Glasgow. And I'm like, that's amazing. And after 2 weeks, she quit her job. And his job required a driver's license. And he lied about having one. And he lied about how he lost it, I think, through DUI in California. And then he got a DUI here. And then he started not living up to his word. And after about 1.5 years, I think they were selling off personal items to make the world work financially. And he called and he said, can you or your parents help me out with some money? And I know his parents very well, because I grew up on the same street for years with him and his parents. We would camp together. I'm like, well, how come your parents aren't helping you? Like, they won't help me. And I'm like, I think it's time for you to leave this area. And I'm not going to recommend that my family give you money. He said, why? So I don't want your stink on me. A week later, he was living in Missoula, and I said, better fit for you. Because he just, it's a different world when you live in a small town. You're under the microscope, whether you want that or not. You're under the microscope.
Yeah, we don't like to admit it, but there's a circle, and you're either inside the circle or you're outside the circle.
And it's a good thing, because to some degree it grows you up.
Yeah. And it probably goes all the way back to your first idea of the conversation of the cold weather farming. We all have that mentality of you still have to survive winter.
Yeah.
And if you are doing these other things, it doesn't work.
Well, and if you can, I watched my grandfathers help other people, and there might be a day where you need help. And you help partly because you want to help the community, and it's the right thing to do. But there's also a day where you might need help, and if you're not there to help somebody else, why is somebody else like, I don't know, this guy isn't really part of the community, right?
Yeah.
And so I really believe that microscope, I think, grows up and grows stuff out that just doesn't work in a small town, small farming town. And so I kind of knew in the back of my mind my friend wouldn't survive living in a small town. And it has nothing to do with this town, it's just small town culture. He had spent too many years and never had the opportunity as a kid to really be around something so drastically different than metropolitan America. And so when he said he was moving to Missoula, I was relieved. I'm like, that's a much better fit for you. So
He probably still thought it was a small town.
probably his in-laws lived over by Missoula, so he had family over there, and I just think it was a better fit. Luckily for me, I had so much experience as a kid. Coming back here, I knew what it was about because I had friends in California. Like, can you handle that? I'm like, I know what the culture's like. It's exponentially richer and deeper than anything you'll experience in metropolitan America. You will never live in fourth gear. Nothing happens in fourth gear like it does in metropolitan. The world doesn't move as fast, and that's rich. That's better. Trying to live your whole life in metropolitan America in third and fourth gear all the time is exhausting. And so I would tell my friends all the time, there's a certain amount of richness you'll never know.
Yeah, no, we're very lucky to have gotten to grow up here.
Yeah, in your character, your morality, your work ethic, there's a lot of stuff that comes from living in a small town, especially a small farming town. And you're blessed, I think, if your parents and grandparents and multiple generations were cold weather farming operating people, and you got to see that ideally from multiple generations as a kid. I think it resonates in who you are as both a man and a woman, because it's really comes down to spouse, children, community, and working your land. And there's just a lot of value in that, and a lot of simplicity as well.
Yeah. So what were some of your favorite memories?
My all-time favorite memory is probably moving cattle with Johnny Porteen. I used to love to do that, and it was usually a family affair, right? The Herrings would show up. My Aunt Elma and her daughters. The Joneses would show up. It might be Mike or Chuck. But typically it was a family affair. There was usually, my mom might be on a horse, her other sister might be on a horse, Joanne. So there was usually anywhere from 5 to 10 of us out there. And so I always expected it to be a group event. And there was one summer I was probably, 8 or 10. I wasn't even tall enough to get on the horse. And I'm sitting in the kitchen watching my grandmother cook. The truck pulls up, and you hear the door shut, and Johnny Porteen comes in and says, "Get your boots on, we're moving cattle." And I look around, and it's just me and him. And I'm thinking, is he really going to move cattle with me by myself? I can't even get on the horse. And so he's like, "Come on, let's go." And I'm like, oh, he's serious. I'm thinking, this guy's crazy. And so we go outside, and he throws me up on the horse. And we go further south out the back of his property. And you can't see the house, can't see anybody else's house, and we're moving cattle. And I don't know at that age that you can just lead them like he was leading him from the front. And I was bringing up the rear to make sure the stragglers stayed in the back. So I didn't know the cattle would necessarily follow him. I thought that was interesting. But
well, what that meant was he's a very good cattleman.
Right?
Not all of them are going to do that.
He probably could have done it without me, right? And so I was like, wow, that's interesting. And so I'm at the back, and he takes the cattle up and over a hill, and I can't see him. And I'm literally, a mile or 2 or 3 from the house, and I have no idea where I'm at, which direction the house is. And all of a sudden, there's a cow and a calf stuck in a watering hole that's turned into mud, and they can't get out, and it's kind of gooey and sticky, and so this is, talking about solving problems in a world of limited resources. I get my first taste of this, right? Here I am, there's nobody to call, there's no cell phones, there's no nothing.
If you get off the horse, you don't think you can get back on.
This was my first thought. I was like, don't get off the horse. Whatever you do, don't get off the horse. And so I'm trying to figure out, okay, I'm stuck here by myself. My grandfather's going to expect me to solve this problem by myself. And so I thought to myself, don't get off the horse. Do what your grandfather would do. So I started moving the horse back and forth and shaking my hat and yelling in Finn. And so I was probably cussing, because that's the only the only words I knew he ever said were Finnish cuss words. I had no idea what I was saying.
Quick little side note, after visiting with your mom yesterday, she doesn't think any of them were cuss words hardly. She just said them like they were cuss words.
Probably. There's a couple I know that were, because I've looked them up. The other ones probably weren't. But so I was just doing this Johnny Porteen routine of yelling and waving my cowboy hat and trying to be as much of a cowboy as I could, and dancing my horse back and forth to spook the cows and the calf. And they finally, after several minutes, got out, and we got them all the way back up to the herd. I never told him that story, and I probably didn't say that story until a few years ago for the first time to my parents. And it's one of the funnest things I've done on the ranch, and it was the first time I got to implement the whole solving complex problems in a world of limited resources. And so to me, it really connects me to my grandfather, Johnny Porteen, in many ways, personally, emotionally, intellectually, and probably my single favorite memory. And I have one like that on the Rosendahl side as well. Much later, I think I was 16. The Rosendahls left to go to a hardware store convention in Minnesota. And so when I was a kid, we'd have dinner in the Rosendahl household, and John would say, let's go, get in the car. And that meant we were just going to drive through the farm, and come back, and just make sure everything was in place and nothing was out of order. And so from the age of 5 to 16, we did this a lot. And I kept thinking, nothing is ever out of place. Why do we keep doing this? The one time he leaves, he's in Minnesota, I'm here by myself, and my uncle, who lives on that farm at the time, was one town down at a softball tournament. So I was here by myself, had dinner, and I thought, my grandfather would want me to go tool around the farm, just make sure everything was okay. In the back of my head, I'm laughing at myself. This is crazy. There's never anything out of order. I don't even need to do this. That night, it was raining cats and dogs. And I drive out there, and just about every hog on the farm is out in the barley field.
Oh.
And I'm laughing at myself. I'm like, here I am for 12 years. This guy's teaching me something I thought was dumb and crazy. And here I am. I have to solve this by myself. Again, no cell phones, no way to contact him, no way to contact my uncle, nobody to run to. And here I am again, later in life, solving a world of problems, in a world of complex problems, in a world of limited resources. And I thought to myself, I know if I get the hogs headed towards the hole in the fence, they'll go in. However, they'll come right back out. So I had to go inside the pen and create a pen within a pen within a pen, so I could move a portion of them all the way into the final pen, lock it up, go back out, get more, put them into the second pen, close it up, open up the first pen, move them all in. And after about 4 attempts of doing this in cat and dog rain, I finally had all the hogs locked up. It took a while, but I thought, that's crazy, but it's one of my favorite stories about being on the Rosendahl side. In that particular case, I wasn't spending the time with them, but again, I got to put to use what you learn in a cold weather farming operation, how to solve problems with limited resources.
And you got to do something that, one, was never going to be an option growing up in California.
No.
But two, in those situations, for most people, responsibilities are seen as a punishment or a negative. Why do I have to do this?
Yeah.
And it's not until you get out here and it's truly, this is something that as a child you should not be responsible for. But you are, and you're able to do it, like you said, complex problem with limited resources. And I'm not sure I've personally experienced something that has a better sense of accomplishment. It can bring more joy to people than being able to have those responsibilities and take care of it yourself.
I think spending time on a farm, you get to have that experience consistently all the time. And so it becomes part of your DNA. Mm-hmm. And the flip side of responsibility is also accountability. They're interlinked, right? And so you kind of tend to grow up into an adult who can handle that, right? So when you're being held accountable as an adult, you can handle it like an adult. But you're also likely to be the kind of adult who goes out and creates results and responsibility with very little oversight, which has been my experience professionally. I've rarely needed management. And so when you grow up in that environment, because the cold weather farmer or rancher is really about results. They have a high IQ to create results out of typically a poor piece of dirt that's covered in snow for 7 months with a limited amount of things you can grow on it and a limited amount of things you can raise on it. And a lot of the variables are out of your control, weather and rain. And so how do you financially survive in a world, and I hear this today, my grandfathers used to say it 50 years ago, in a 10-year cycle, and I break even 5 years, I make money 3, and I lose money 2. If that changes, you might be out of business, right? As a banker, I've seen clients consistently grow profit every year. That's easy to get your head around in finance as a banker. But somebody whose finances change wildly every year based on conditions that are kind of out of their control, how do you look at the last 3 years and go, well, how can I rely on you paying me back? And it really comes down to the ability of the cold weather farmer to generate results out of their responsibility and their drive and their intellect. And so it's a very different world, and I think you'll find that they have a higher drive, a higher work ethic, and an attachment to responsibility that you just can't find in metropolitan America.
Well, it's amazing what would the term be, delayed gratification, the fact that I have to do something now that not only might not pay me back at the end of this season, might be several years down the road, and then also account
could be
for
a couple generations.
It's almost harder probably than the old country, because in the old country it was much more it was very extreme, but it was much more consistent from year to year.
Yeah. Versus
here in Montana, where not only are we dealing with 100-degree summers to 40-below-degree winters, we'll also go from very wet years like the last 2 to almost no moisture the years before.
Yep.
So year over year, you're not only planning about this next season coming up or the next winter, you might be planning out, okay, how do I deal with the next 2 or 3 year drought?
Yeah. How does that fit in my rotation of crops that I have to do?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. No, it's a fascinating world that I think produces a great deal of richness. I'll say it again, I think there's more peace and joy in this part of America than there is in metropolitan, hands down. And for a variety of reasons, but I think the farming community just produces that in spades.
Yeah. You'd mentioned it a couple times, getting to be in your grandmother's kitchen while she was cooking. Yeah. That's something that I think a lot of us probably take for granted a little bit or maybe overlook, but what were the greatest meals that they cooked for you up here? Because I'm sure every ounce of it was homemade.
On the Rosendahl side, not so much.
Oh, okay.
There was more canned and packaged food on the Rosendahl side, probably because my grandmother Eleanor was working in the hardware store and was spending a lot of time there and in the church. Almost everything on the Porteen side was scratch. I would say in the Rosendahl side, my grandmother made something that I would call deconstructed pot pie.
Oh.
And my mom makes a version that is just flawless. It's probably one of the favorite meals that the Rosendahl men, including my uncle, eat. And it's basically just hamburger, canned corn, mushroom soup with mushrooms over mashed potatoes. And instead of doing it with greens in a pot pie, we do it deconstructed, and it's one of the tastiest things. And when we make it, my Uncle Kurt shows up, and it's his favorite thing. On the Rosendahl side, they had a tradition of doing steak fondue at Christmas. And steak fondue is a delicious way to eat steak. So I always looked forward to that because my parents maintained that tradition when I was a kid back in California. And we only had it once a year, but it was so tasty to eat steak that way. It was just seared right on the outside and yet still just tender on the inside and just so good. Marion Porteen could cook a steak as well or better than anybody. And she also cooked fried chicken that was just delicious. But I think my favorite thing, she would make thin bread for Johnny. And I've never had bread that tasty. And homemade bread out of the oven is always good, you know. But her homemade thin bread was just, it's almost disappointing because I don't know anybody who makes it anymore. And I don't know anybody who can make it probably like she does. Marion was a great cook. She had a lot of practice at it. She was very good at it all the way around. She's a very good cook.
That's awesome. I can't imagine that fried chicken came from the grocery store. What was that like coming, from that metropolitan area and being at a place that they would butcher their own meat?
Yeah, probably by the time I came around, the chickens on the ranch started to go away. So it was by the time I came around, it was probably more chicken from the store.
Okay.
When I was really young, 5, 6, and 7, they still had some chickens, and there was still a slop bucket you took out and fed the chickens. But by the time I was probably 9 or 10, they were gone. So I don't know if I had that experience of ranch butchered animals. If I did, it was probably more, because I know the Porteens would have a hog butchered, and they would probably butcher a cow. But not so much in the chickens. And I don't think the Rosendahls ever butchered anything. They used to get their stuff from the grocery store. So I didn't have that experience. If I did, I didn't know it. Because it wasn't, probably earlier in life before I came along, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I know a lot of times we like to think that this little town is frozen in time up here, and it definitely moves slower, but it's not frozen in time. But a lot of us, when you're here for several years, you don't see the little changes, but you probably had a little bit more of a unique perspective with your childhood than mine, is that yours were almost snapshots.
Yeah.
So over those years, how has the town changed from time to time that you've come up?
I think the snapshot analysis is actually accurate. I don't think it's actually changed a great deal. Maybe subtly, because it's at its core, it's really about spouse, kids, greater family, and community. That hasn't changed at all. Maybe the politics have changed a little bit. Maybe the ideologies of some people have changed a little bit. But if you look at the town, it's still the same size as it was when I was a kid. There hasn't been hardly any new buildings in town except for the replacement of the Northern Bar. A couple of buildings have been taken down that probably should have been taken down 20 or 30 years ago.
Sad to see him go, but it was time.
Well, the family's hardware store, that was sad to see it go, where you're like, that should have went down like 30 years ago. Just waiting for somebody to, hurt themselves in. But I think when you get back to what the town is really all about, it's a small farming town, and that's, again, kids, spouse, greater family, and community. That really hasn't changed. So I think it's a soft change from when I was a kid. It's not a big change. Like, I can go back to where I grew up in California, and it's wildly different. I mean, the town I grew up in was 25,000 people, and there were farms in between it and the next town 10 miles away. The town I grew up in now is 60 to 70,000 people, and it's just cement all the way across from one town to the next. There's no more farms. It's just one big metropolitan area, and the culture has changed wildly over that 40-year period. So very different. So I don't think Hinsdale has changed a lot. Again, I would say it's probably more in some ideologies and political attitudes, but the core of the town is still the same.
Yeah. So if you could go back and relive one day, what day would it be?
It would have to be that day with Johnny Porteen moving cattle. He was not a big talker, and I wish I'd spent more time with him and more time probing him, because there was a lot of... He was always teaching people through his conduct and through how he ran his operation. Very intelligent at being a cattle rancher. And that one day was just the day I wish we would have talked about it. And that kind of represents how I wish we would have talked to him more about who he was. But and these are just tears of joy, really. But that one, that one day really represents, in totality, what I was able to extract from all my time with him. That helped me in my life professionally. And who I chose as clients, and how I chose to work in a work ethic and create results. So if I had to relive one moment up here, it would be that moment.
Thank you for sharing that.
It's probably... I actually told that story, I forgot about this, at his funeral, when I did his eulogy. So that would be the one time I'd live over. Love that question, by the way, because
Well, I'm glad I asked.
that day and moment will always resonate with me. As important and as big. And it was quintessentially him. And I tell everybody this in California. You missed out not having a cowboy as a relative. I mean, you really did. And I mean a true quintessential shin-kicking cowboy. You really, unless you've had a cowboy or a cold weather farmer as an idol, you really missed out.
Yeah.
And you just can't put that in context for somebody who grew up in a big city. They just don't get it.
Yep. Everyone looks at the rodeo dudes and thinks those are the cowboys.
Yeah.
And any of us that have grown up with them know that it's the soft-spoken rancher that knew every cow and could ride any horse and never boasted.
Worked 14 hours a day without any help. Was there to was there to work his tail off and produce for everybody in the family and grow kids and grandkids and be the rock. The cowboy on the rodeo circuit is just a manifestation of a small part of that. It's almost like the glorification part of what a cowboy is. But yeah, you know, yeah. I was blessed to have a cowboy in my life.
Well, I know that he probably deeply cherished those weeks that you would come up as well.
You know, I think he liked having his grandkids on the ranch. I truly believe that. I wish as a kid I would have understood the subtle difference between him and my other grandfather, because the Rosendahl grandfather just said, get in the truck, we're going out to the farm. And I was like, cool! And I think Johnny wanted to see you ask to be a part of it more so. And I didn't understand that as a kid. Because I think he wanted to see if that was really what you wanted to do, see if you really wanted to be a farmer and a rancher kind of thing. And I don't think he wanted to press you if that wasn't. Yeah, no, I'd live that day over every day.
Well, it's not every day you get to imitate your idol and get such a fantastic result.
Yeah, that's what I call a 1% day. You know, there's 1% of your days in your life that stand out as just so rich. You're like, wow, I'm lucky to have that day. So that was 1% day. A 1% of a 1% day. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I can follow that up with anything. So if there's any more stories or anything else you'd like to talk about, I'm glad to sit here and talk, but I'm not sure I can top that.
I think we covered how important having access to your grandparents and your greater family is, whether it's every day like you grew up or whether I came back for a couple of months, and how important and valuable being part of a small farming town is to your being. I think we covered that in spades. Yeah.